begin, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Steve. Steve Nelle. Steve has worked in conservation for 47 years. He was with the NRCS. He retired in 2012 and has been doing independent consulting with landowners and groups like this. He is a teacher in rangeland restoration and riparian ecology. He's a friend. I've known him for 20 years. Above all, he's a teacher. And he's also a writer and a frequent speaker. And he lives in San Angelo with his wife. I'm just so glad to have you here, Steve. Thank you so much.
The pictures sort of tell the story. I'm just sort of narrating the pictures, but very good to be here with you today. Thank you for investing your afternoon with us. Stewardship along the Pecos. We're going to be talking first about some general stewardship lessons and then some principles and practices which might be appropriate for this part of the state. And when we say along the Pecos, we're not talking about just along the river itself. We're talking about all the way to the horizon, north, south, east, and west. So we're really talking about the whole basin, the whole watershed, not just the river corridor. As you know, the Pecos River runs through some pretty harsh landscape, and it's been treated harshly by our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. We've inherited some management that happened, 75, 100, 120 years ago, and so that's what we live with, and that's what we have to deal with. This is the Devil's River, not the Pecos, but the concept of stewardship is universal. No matter where you're at, I want to drill into at least my concept of what is land stewardship. And I did not learn land stewardship from a textbook or at college or from a seminar. I learned it from people like this. These are some of my mentors, some of the ranchers that I've had the pleasure of working with who demonstrated stewardship on their properties. And so I tried to watch them, I tried to listen to them, I tried to be their student as they were having to manage their piece of property. And even though they demonstrated stewardship and I learned sort of what the concept was, I would never have been able to put it into words until I studied the writings of Aldo Leopold. So raise your hand if you know who Aldo Leopold is. So about half of you in there. So the other half, if I was your teacher and you were the student, I would assign you to read this book, A Sand County Almanac. It's his greatest work, and you will find a connection between yourself and the land when you read this book. So Leopold is the one who codified what land stewardship is, and that's really what that book is all about. And I want to take just a couple of his excerpts that teach us this concept of land stewardship. He said that it is inconceivable to me that an ethical relation to the land can exist without love, respect, and admiration for land, and a high regard for its value. Now there's Leopold, the professor, later in his career. But here's Leopold as a young man when he worked on the Apache National Forest in Arizona. But here's the other excerpt. A land ethic reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, and this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. From those two excerpts, we learn about what stewardship is. Even though he did not use the word stewardship, we can see from what he wrote that this stewardship relation to the land is characterized by a person having a deep respect for the land, an admiration of the land, a love of the land, the recognition that a person can have a relationship with the land and an ethical relationship. that person would have a high regard for the land, not for just its economic value, not just for what it will produce, but for the land itself. That person has a tender conscience toward the land, that conscience, that voice within each of us that tells us right from wrong. And that all of that produces this conviction whereby a person takes responsibilities. I'm going to be the caretaker of this piece of land. So the facets of, this is what defines land stewardship. A land steward could be defined or described as a caretaker, a conservator of the land, one who practices husbandry of the land. That's an old word we don't use as much anymore, but one who practices husbandry of the land, who is a custodian of the land. So even though, yes, they own it, it's my land, I have my rights, that's not how they look at things. They look at things as I'm the custodian, I'm the caretaker. During my tenure on this land, I'm going to be a good custodian. That's what stewardship is all about. Leopold also said, obviously this is not Pecos County, but we're talking these principles now. This is Aldo Leopold talking. The landscape of any farm or ranch is the owner's portrait of himself. Think about that statement and what it means. It's very, very true. When you have this stewardship relation to the land becomes a part of the person. The person becomes a part of the land in a way that's really difficult to explain for non-landowners. It is literally a relationship as you would have with a person or maybe with a pet or a horse or something. And so that's a true statement, and this is an earmark of stewardship. So here's the definition I would propose for land stewardship: a deeply held inner conviction that motivates landowners to care for and sustain the land that has been entrusted to them. And why do they do it? Partly for their own personal benefit, including financial benefit, also for the benefit of future generations, but also for the benefits that accrue to society. And that is perhaps what sets apart the land steward from just a landowner. They realize that what that they do on that piece of property affects other people. It benefits other people. So there's a great deal of benevolence involved in being a genuine land steward. It's really about who you are on the inside. It's about that connection that you have to a piece of land. It's about that relationship you have with a piece of land. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the principles and practices as to how a land steward, the nuts and bolts of how they manage and care for a piece of land. And we're going to look a little bit about grazing, a little bit about the water cycle, a little bit about brush, a little bit about wildlife. Those are not four separate topics. That's one topic, that's one all-encompassing topic with just several different facets. You cannot and should not ever divide those into four separate topics. They all apply to every acre. So if we're talking about grazing in the desert, obviously it's a challenge. Y'all know that. It has to be conservative. The stocking rates have to be conservative. You cannot run what Grandpa tried to run. You can't run what somebody over in Big Lake or San Angelo runs. The numbers that you try to run have to be conservative. They have to be flexible because it might rain 5 inches one year and 20 inches the next. Greatly different forage production annually and seasonally. If it's not flexible, it will not work, guaranteed. It has to be flexible stocking rates. You have to incorporate lengthy periods of rest and recovery after you graze. So if you graze a group of animals in a pasture for X number of weeks or months, it has to rest. It has to recover. How long? Depends on rainfall. You don't ever do it by the calendar. There has to be rest and recovery incorporated into your grazing plan, and there has to be timely destocking. By that, I mean you don't wait until after you run out of grass. You do it you destock when needed, when drought is around the corner and it's happening before your very eyes. You destock before you've totally run out of grass. So it takes really some wisdom and foresight and knowledge about that kind of thing. In 1914, a gentleman named R.E. Dixon gave this advice to his fellow ranchers in West Texas. He said, "Don't pray for rain if you can't take care of what you get." That was really good advice for over 100 years ago. People weren't thinking about that kind of thing 100 years ago. But what did Mr. Dixon mean? He meant being able to take care of however little or much rain you get, keeping your pastures in such a condition where the water actually wants to soak into the ground, where the soil holds rainfall like a sponge, to where it can sustain plant growth for a long period of time. So he's talking about managing for a water-catching landscape, where the soil holds the water, catches the water, stores the water, as opposed to a water-shedding landscape, which is what we see in a lot of places now, whereby if you get a little half-inch rain like this, it doesn't want to soak in. The soil is dysfunctional. The water cycle is broken. It's capped, it's crusted. It's as if you spread grout on the surface of the soil, and then it just begins to run off. So this is what you see here. It's puddled up here, but it's already starting to run off, and that's a half-inch rain. So we don't want to manage for water shed. We want to manage for water catching. So we use the word water catchment more so than watershed. There you see a water shedding landscape on the far side of the fence, water catching landscape. It's all about grazing. Here, this is around San Angelo. It's a 20-inch rainfall belt, but it's the same thing. Water shedding landscape on the left, water catching landscape on the right. Water is soaking in. This is a 40-inch rainfall belt. When I worked in Gonzales, the right-hand side, a man-made drought. In a 40-inch rainfall belt, a man-made perpetual drought because of the way it's being grazed so short, there's no deep-rooted grasses. That rainfall runs off, carrying soil with it. Left side, water catching landscape. Every drop, a hard 4-inch rain, it's all soaking in because it's like this huge absorbent sponge on the left side. It's all about how grasses are grazed. It's all about how pastures are grazed, leaving stubble on those grasses, not grazing them down to a stub. That's what it's all about. We could easily spend an hour talking just about that and why it's so important. Notice here some of that ungrazed grass. This grass that's ungrazed is not going to waste. Look what it turns into. Residue, litter on the surface. That's the blanket on the soil. That's what helps keep that soil from baking at 140 degrees like you cook your steak. So it's all about grazing properly, modestly, leaving stubble, leaving residue, not grazing like this. Consider the value of the residual grass cover out here in the desert and the reasons why we have to manage it so carefully. You need a hydrologic cover. You need that grass to create a water-catching landscape. So it's a hydrologic cover. It's a cover that helps build soil health because that soil needs to be shaded and covered and with some organic matter leaching down into it. It provides, if you're interested in wildlife, fawning cover, nest cover, and it also provides livestock forage. But the value of grass is far greater than its value as forage. That's just one of several things. And so the rancher, the livestock producer, has to allocate his grass, however much or little he has to allocate it differently to accommodate all of those ecological needs. And I guarantee you that this and this are just as ecologically important as this might be to you. Some people out here have employed the concept of ripping, which is just a way to jumpstart the water cycle and force rainfall to go into the ground by ripping furrows in it with either a chisel or a ripper or a keyline plow, usually on the contour or on a key line. So that's one thing that some people have tried with success. You have to put the pencil to it for sure, because this is a temporary measure. And the way it's managed after the ripping determines whether you get long-term benefit out of it. So I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do it. It's just one of the ideas that works. Some of you are interested in wildlife, and obviously you already know that wildlife and livestock can coexist very well in the Trans-Pecos. It's not just pronghorn, it's ground nesting birds, it's migratory birds, it's mule deer, it's bighorn sheep, it's all these things. But there's the important thing to remember. Wildlife thrive best in diverse landscapes. Not monocultures, not simple landscapes, but diverse landscapes. A variety of grasses, a variety of shrubs, a variety of weeds and forbs and herbaceous plants. That's where wildlife thrive. Lots of the Trans-Pecos looks like this. That's not really what most landowners want as their ideal landscape. And so it's been pretty common over the last 20, 30 years to use a herbicide to kill that creosote and tar bush, and perhaps get something along this line. I mean, if you can go from that to that, that's pretty interesting. That gets your attention. If you can go from that to even something like this in the desert, sometimes that drastic of an improvement happens. So, is that productive? Yes or no? Yes, it's highly productive. Is that diverse? No, it's not diverse. So you got to think, you're thinking both things at the same time, not just productivity. This is a herbicide that has become very popular, spike, tebethiuron. And with anything we do in life, we should consider the side effects before we try it, not after, not consider them afterwards. And so anybody who's thinking about some of these herbicidal applications, you have to read and understand the label, what it says, what it means, what it doesn't say. The spike label says it is intended for control of woody vegetation. It does not specify which woody plants. It controls woody vegetation. It may not say this on the label, but I know it to be true. It will also control broadleaf forbs and weeds because it's mainly a broadleaf killer. So it's going to affect woody vegetation, broadleaf weeds and forbs. It remains active in the soil for several years. That's one reason why it's so effective, but that's also the same reason why it has a long-term detrimental effect on some of the plants you really want to keep out there. So you got to be so careful with these side effects. And because it remains active for several years, it's like getting repeat applications over time, repeat applications. One application, but it stays active. And then it says on the label, do not apply spike in the vicinity of desirable plants. That's what it says. That's the warning to the person that wants to use it. What's a desirable plant? Depends on your objectives, depends on your stewardship mindset. But these are some of the desirable plants that, as defined by wildlife. And so the upper left, javelina bush, wolfberry, there's wolfberry. What happens to them after spike? They either disappear or they're injured severely and reduced. And they don't come back quickly. These are broadleaf forbs. What happens to them after application of spike? They decline and or injured or severely reduced. And they don't come back quickly. So I'm not saying don't use spike. I'm saying you need to know the side effects if you're interested in wildlife. and maybe modify how you use spike. So that looks pretty impressive to just a livestock person. That does not look very impressive to a wildlife person. It's productive, it's not diverse. I think this is a true statement. Healthy grasslands are measured more by diversity than by productivity. If you want a healthy grassland, it needs to be diverse. This is typically the way that spike is applied, 1,000 acres, or it could be 10,000. You do a block in year one, because this stuff is kind of expensive. You can't do the whole landscape. A year or two later, you do block number 2. A year or two later, you do block number 3. This herbicide is oftentimes applied in very large, widespread areas. It doesn't have to be that way. The herbicide, which has a place, can be applied like this, in strips, leaving some untreated. So it can be done like that. The width of the strip can vary according to your objectives. It could be done like this, where you treat strips such as this in year 1, and maybe you wait 5 or 10 years and you treat intervening strips. So you have some that's untreated, some that's newly treated, some that's 5 years old. There's going to be a lot more diversity in that landscape, guaranteed, than if you do the whole 1,000-acre block. You could even get so wild as to treat, let's say, a light rate in strips. This is a pelleted herbicide. It can be put out in strips or whatever pattern you want. A light rate here, another light rate in the opposing direction, so that what you end up with is some areas that are untreated, light rate, heavy rate. You're going to get a lot more habitat diversity when you use something like that. And of course, the width of those strips can obviously vary. It can look like that. It's called variable rate application. And it reminds us of what your grandpa and grandma taught you: in all things, moderation. So be mindful of these things if you're thinking about using herbicides that are non-selective. It could be spike, it could be Invora, there's others. These products have residual activity, and they're not selective. So it's not to say don't use them. It's to say use them carefully, judiciously, and with some restraint. So we're trying to get a diverse landscape. It's good for livestock, it's good for wildlife. We want grass, we want cactus and yucca and soto, we want shrubs, we want flowers, we want all of it in the landscape. You have to be intentional with your management to retain all these or to restore all these things. It has been said that those who do not understand nature are destined to deplete it. Well, this is a Central Texas photo, and obviously this is all about grazing. There's a lot of ways to deplete nature besides overgrazing. That's one way, but there's lots of ways that nature can be depleted. And this is a true statement. Those who do not understand how nature works, they don't take care of it. But the corollary to this, and the good news, is that those who understand nature best are compelled or inspired or motivated to take care of it, to conserve it. So really that makes our job, my job and your job, that's where the Friend of the Pecos exists, to help people understand nature better. The river, the uplands, the water catchment, the watershed, wildlife, grazing, oil field interactions. The better we understand these things, the better job we're going to want to do to take care of it. Some of you may recognize this as Philip Robbins, who passed away 15 or 20 years ago. One of the men I really look up to as a land steward, conservationist deluxe over in Pecos County. He loved that old ranch. You could just tell it by being around him. It's not that he stood around saying, "Oh, I love this ranch, I'm such a land steward." That's not what he did. He did it by his actions and by his attitudes. You could tell he loved and respected, and he took care of that old ranch. So today what we've looked at is some of the ethical philosophies about how we think about land. We've looked at a few principles. We've looked at a few practices. With our ethics, we engage the heart, what's inside of you. With the principles, we engage the mind, the mental faculties. And with the practices, we engage our hands, our pocketbooks. That's where the work is really done. Way too often, people want to fast forward to the practices. What should I do? Give me a list of things to do. That's not the place to start. It has to start with the ethics. You have to understand the principles. And then when those things have had a chance to stew and inform you, then is when you start thinking about the practices. But too often, we just want to fast forward and what should I do on this 100 acres or 1,000 acres? What should I do on this pasture? I'm saying slow up, consider the ethical responsibilities, consider the principles, the big picture, and then hone in on the practices. So anyway, that's the message I came to deliver today. Again, many of you in this room know a lot more than I do about the Chihuahuan Desert and the Pecos River. And so you probably ought to be the one that's up here talking, but I'll at least share you with my 2 cents worth, and happy to hear your perspectives on really any of this. So thank you.
Maybe we can put the lights on for the little Q&A and keep your mic on for a minute. Do we have any questions? Anybody want to kick off? Yes.
The Ocotillo, is it native to this area?
Yes. Ocotillo, not across the whole landscape, but in certain soils types, it's very native. Yeah.
There's a lot, there's a couple of huge swaths of it over here. I assume that somebody had brought it in as an ornamental plant, and then it's just spread.
Well, in a town setting, it might be brought in, but in the landscape, yeah, it's a native. It's one of the defining species of the Chihuahuan Desert. Yeah. And bighorn sheep, by the way, when that thing is blooming, they'll ride their bodies up over that Ocotillo to eat those blossoms. So got pretty tough here, And not just questions, but comments and observations. Yeah.
Are there any sections of original grassland that still exist within the Pecos watershed?
Can you hear that?
Are there some remnant grasslands?
Yeah, the original grasslands.
Yeah, they're scattered around. They are scattered around. Most ranches have some areas that still have good amounts of black grama and bush muley and plains bristle, and some of these others, blue grama, depending on what site you're at. The grasses are still here. They're not in their original amount. They're not in their original composition, but all of the good grasses are still in this landscape. Sometimes they're protected by prickly pear, lechuguilla or agarita bush, where they could not have been destroyed. And that's why we have to thank the Lord for agarita and lechuguilla and catclaw, because that's its ecological function as a nursery plant. And it has preserved those plants, even when great-grandpa overgrazed the snot out of these ranches, which they did. Not on purpose. They did the best they knew. But, so yeah, those grasses are still here, but not in the same proportions.
And so would they be part of like the original grasslands, like the tall grass of the west and the shorter grass on the east of the prairies? Is it this grass here, the native grass here, is it analogous to the wild grasslands?
I'm really deaf, so I'm going to ask Christy to sort of repeat that.
I need you to repeat it again because I'm not fully understanding the question. And then
I think he's asking to compare the desert grasslands with the tall grass and short grass prairie of the plains. Is that
Yeah, the short grass. And tall grass.
Well, there's no similarity between desert grassland and, say, the taller mid-grass prairie, and there's no similarity, really.
That's what I wanted.
Yeah, they're different grasses. They can tolerate drought, heat, to the extreme, but they're not as productive, and they got to be. And when you when you injure the grasslands in a desert, you really pay for it because it does not bounce back as quick. So that's another reason to be conservative. It does not bounce back like it does when you get 20 inches of rain or 25. The land is more forgiving. This land is not very forgiving. You have to be extra careful.
Because the soil is more fragile, and then when you destroy that natural grass, you're also negatively affect the actual native soil too. That's part of it not rebounding.
Yeah, and the drought, rainfall is the big issue. Yes, sir.
So in the Edwards Plateau where we are today, could you talk a little more about the importance of shade? Grasslands management, please.
Man, I'm glad you brought that up because over the last 10 or 15 years, I've come to the increasing clarity in my mind, regardless of what you think about the politics of climate change and global warming, forget about the cause and effect and what's going on there. But I think the sun is baking these soils more and more over time, and bare ground is the worst enemy of any landowner. So a little bush of mariola or lechuguilla or any bush that casts a little bit of shade in the morning, a little bit of shade in the afternoon, a little bit of shade on the north side, that goes a long way in moderating that soil temperature. And you put a thermometer on the surface and you're going to get this 120, 140, 150 degree. That destroys soils. That destroys the life. So it's so important. And that's the other reason why that blanket of residual grass needs to fall back onto the surface to become litter and a blanket, providing again that shade and insulation. So I think it's extremely important. And I've been seeing that over time. So important. It makes you have a different perspective about brush. Me, it does anyway. Yes, sir.
I think one thing that needs to be brought up is the biodiversity of the desert is much greater than where it rains more. And you see a lot of people that come out here to the desert and they want to apply what they learned where it rains more, and they want to apply that to the desert, and that's where they mess up. They don't recognize the biodiversity and what it takes to manage out here in the desert.
This last weekend, me and a buddy took our grandsons to Big Bend Ranch State Park, and we did a little bit of hiking. It was just amazing. You just walk, and every step, there's something different. They didn't appreciate it so much, but if you have your eyes to see it, there's a lot of diversity. There's so much diversity, so I'm glad you brought that up. It's really important. It's not just about grasses. Great-grandpa thought it was just, we got to grow a lot of grass for these cows. And yes, that's okay, but we need the forbs and the cactus and the lechuguilla and all these things, and even things that a cow doesn't eat. So it's so important.
I think you said, I'd love to hear you say, it's about what you see on the land, and I think that's, in my experience with you, Steve, and the things that you listed here, the ethics, the principles, the practices, but also just the ability to see what's out there is one thing that I've always gotten from you, is just how to open your eyes and see what's there.
We have this phrase we use, learning to read the land, and it's very much like learning to read a book. The language of the land is the plant life, and as you become more and more astute in observing what the plants are and what their niche is and where they grow, you will be learned to tell, you'll be able to interpret the story of that pasture or that area. It's a very interesting part of nature study, is to be able to read the land. And where's Julie? So Julie's mom and I spent a lot of time together, and she used to have a statement. She says, the more you look, the more you will see. It's so intuitive, but we just walk or drive or ride horseback or whatever without really looking closely. So it's important to learn that skill of curiosity and just being so observant and walking slow so you can really see what's there. All very good points. Thank you for bringing those up.